I was close enough to hear the gloved hand crack against his shoulder, and close enough to see that the guard did not so much as blink. The man in the dark suit shoved him again, harder this time, both palms flat against the red wool, and the guard rocked back half a step on the worn stone and came forward again like a door swinging shut. "Off the post," the man barked, in an accent I couldn't place. "Move. You move when we say move." Then a third man stepped in from the side with something small and black in his fist, and I heard the sharp electric snap of it before my mind caught up with what my eyes had already filed away, and I lifted my phone because that is what I do. That is the only thing I have ever known how to do when the world tilts. I point a lens at it and I keep my hand steady. My name is Daniel Royce, and for 19 years I have stood in press lines at gates I was never permitted to enter, watching motorcades come and go and writing down which dignitary smiled and which one did not. I have a notebook in my coat that has seen 4 continents. I had been told this would be a slow morning. A visiting delegation, a foreign cabinet's deputy minister and his security detail, arriving at the gates of Renmore Palace for a courtesy call before the formal banquet, the kind of arrival that fills a paragraph and never the front page. I had positioned myself at the rope barrier on the public side of the forecourt, 60 feet from the guardhouse, expecting nothing. What I got instead was a man in a tall black bearskin and a crimson tunic being assaulted in broad daylight, and a crowd of tourists going very, very quiet around me. The guard's name, I would learn later, was Sergeant Aldous Wren, no relation to the palace, just one of those small coincidences the world likes to hand you. At that moment I knew none of it. I knew only what the lens knew. A young man, perhaps 30, jaw like a shelf of rock, eyes fixed on a point above the heads of the men crowding him, white gloves still at his sides, rifle still shouldered, every muscle in his body refusing the most natural thing in the world, which is to defend yourself. The black device snapped again near his ribs. I saw his shoulders draw in a fraction, the only sign that any current had touched him at all, and then he straightened. He straightened and he stood, and he did not raise a hand. I have replayed that half-second more times than I can count. Everyone asks me about the rally that came after, the part that made the footage travel the world, but the part I cannot shake is the stillness, the choosing of it. A man with a weapon and the training to use it, being struck and shocked and shoved off the stone he was sworn to hold, and choosing, with his whole body, not to give the men in front of him the reaction they had come to provoke. "He's not going to do anything," whispered a woman beside me, an American tourist in a sun hat, her own phone shaking in her grip. "Why isn't he doing anything?" I didn't answer her. I was watching the suited man, the one who'd given the order, turn to a colleague and laugh. That laugh told me everything I needed to know about why this was happening. These were men accustomed to a certain kind of obedience. Somewhere, a velvet rope had been moved for them their entire lives. They had arrived at a foreign palace expecting the local statuary to step aside, and when the statue did not, they had decided to make it. The deputy minister himself stood a little apart, near a long black car idling at the inner gate, watching his men work and finding it, evidently, beneath his notice. He was a soft-faced man in an expensive coat, checking something on a phone. I would put his face on a memory card and forget it within the week. He was not the story. The story was the sergeant, and the second thing the suited man said, which I caught clean on the audio. "Salute the minister." A pause. "You salute when a man of his rank passes. Salute or we remove you." And here is the thing the men in the dark suits did not understand, the thing I did not understand either, standing at the rope with my pulse in my ears. They thought they were dealing with a man. One man, alone, in a silly hat, who could be pushed. They did not know they were dealing with everything that stood behind him. Sergeant Wren turned his head. Just his head, a slow quarter turn, and he looked at the man who had given the order, not with anger. I want to be precise about this, because anger was what they were fishing for. He looked at him the way you'd look at a piece of weather. And he spoke, for the first and only time in that whole encounter, in a voice so level it carried farther than a shout. "I don't salute on command," he said. "And I don't leave my post." Then he faced front again. I heard the suited man's breath go thin. I have interviewed enough powerful people to know the precise sound a powerful person makes when they realize, for the first time in years, that a thing they ordered has simply not happened. It is a small sound. It is the sound of the floor moving. What he did next, he did because he could not bear that sound. He nodded to the man with the black device, and the man stepped in again, and this time he didn't aim for the ribs. He aimed for the guard's hand, the gloved hand resting on the rifle, and the snap of it was loud enough that the woman beside me cried out, and I felt the whole crowd flinch as one body. The rifle's stock dipped. The sergeant's arm jerked. For one terrible instant, I thought he would go down. He did not go down. He brought the rifle back up to the slope of his shoulder, white glove finding its place, and he locked his eyes forward, and a thin line of something sweat, I told myself, just sweat, ran down from under the band of the bearskin and along his jaw, and he let it. He did not wipe it. He stood in the morning light at the gate of Renmore with 3 men around him who had hit him, shocked him, and ordered him gone, and he held the post as though the post were the last solid thing on earth. And somewhere above us, behind a window I could not see, somebody else was watching too. I didn't know that yet. None of us in the crowd knew it. But the palace has eyes the way a face has eyes, and what those eyes had just recorded was a foreign hand laid, 3 times, on a man who wore the king's red. The suited man straightened his jacket. He thought it was over. He thought he had won, in the only way men like him understand winning. He had hit something and it hadn't hit back. He turned toward the idling car to rejoin his minister, already reaching up to smooth his hair, already rehearsing how he'd describe this to the others over dinner, the stubborn toy soldier they'd had to put in his place. He had taken perhaps 2 steps when the first sound reached us. It came from inside the gate, from the deep courtyard beyond the arch, a single, flat, mechanical noise, the sound of a heavy bolt being thrown. Then another. Then a third, rolling down the line of the palace wall like a slow heartbeat, and I lowered my phone half an inch and looked up from the screen, because some animal part of me understood before my mind did that the morning had just stopped being slow. I want to describe Renmore as I saw it that day, because what happened next only makes sense if you understand the place. It is not a tourist's palace, all photo ops and changing of the guard pageantry. It is a working seat of a fictional crown, half ancient stone and half modern fortress, and the smiling ceremonial face it shows the public is exactly 1 inch deep. Behind the gilded railings and the cobbled forecourt where the tourists gather, behind the single immaculate sentry in his red and black, there is a second palace that the cameras never find, corridors of men who do not wear bearskins, who carry no rifles you can see, who exist for one purpose. I had heard rumors of it for years. Every palace reporter has. We call it, among ourselves, the quiet floor. I had never seen it move. I was about to. The bolts I'd heard were the inner gates locking, not the decorative outer ones the public photographs. Those stayed open, almost mockingly open, but the real gates, the iron cord ones set back inside the arch, swinging closed on hidden hydraulics with a finality you felt in your teeth. The deputy minister's long black car, which had been idling at the inner gate ready to carry him forward into the courtyard for his courtesy call, was now nose to nose with 2 tons of closed iron. It was not going anywhere, and neither, I realized, was anyone else. The suited man who'd given the orders heard it too. He stopped mid-step, one hand still at his hair, and turned back toward the gate with the beginnings of confusion on his face, the expression of a man who has knocked something off a shelf and is only now hearing it land 3 rooms away. He looked at the closed inner gate. He looked at the sergeant, who had not moved, who stood exactly as he had stood, eyes forward, the line of sweat still drying on his jaw. And then he looked up. We all looked up. Along the top of the palace wall, at intervals I hadn't noticed before because they had been empty, figures were appearing, not running. That is what I remember most clearly. Nobody ran. They simply rose into view, one after another down the length of the parapet, dark silhouettes against the bright sky, and took up positions facing outward and down and stood. There must have been a dozen of them within the first 10 seconds, then more. They wore no ceremonial scarlet. They wore the dull, serious clothes of men who are not there to be looked at, and several of them held things at low ready that I chose, in that moment, not to identify too precisely through my lens. "Oh," said the woman in the sun hat, very softly. "Oh my." I became aware of a low sound underneath everything, a vibration coming up through the cobblestones into the soles of my shoes, and it took me a moment to understand it was engines. Many engines. From somewhere beyond the far end of the forecourt where the boulevard curved away toward the city, the sound of vehicles, heavy ones, moving in formation and not slowly. The crowd at the rope began to turn, heads swiveling toward the boulevard, and I turned with them, and that is when I saw the convoy. I had been told that morning that the royal household was away, that the visiting minister had been received as a deputy's courtesy precisely because the principals of the house were elsewhere, attending to other business, which was why the affair merited only a courtesy call and a single press hack at the rope. I had written that line in my own notebook an hour before. Principals away, low protocol, file by noon. I tell you this so you understand my astonishment when the royal convoy came around the curve of the boulevard at speed. 6 vehicles in a tight diamond, dark and gleaming and absolutely silent, except for that bone-deep engine note, and swung not past the palace but directly toward the forecourt, toward the gate, toward the rope, toward us. The principals were not away, or if they had been, they were away no longer. Somebody had turned that diamond of steel around and pointed it home, and it was coming fast. "Back," a new voice said, hard and clear, and I felt a hand on my shoulder steering me, one of the outer sentries who had appeared from somewhere, moving the press and the tourists back from the rope with a firmness that brooked nothing. "Behind the line. Now please, all the way back." His courtesy was the courtesy of a man clearing a field of fire, and I went where he pointed and kept my lens up, because I had finally understood that I was no longer watching a slow morning. I was watching a kingdom answer a question, and the question was, what happens to a man who lays hands on the king's red? The deputy minister had emerged from behind his stranded car. I could see him now in full, the soft-faced man in the expensive coat, and the softness had gone out of his face entirely. He was speaking rapidly to the suited man, his head of detail, I assumed, and the suited man was no longer the picture of casual authority he'd been 90 seconds earlier. He was gesturing toward the sergeant, toward the gate, toward the wall full of silent figures, and I did not need the audio to read the shape of what he was saying. He was saying some version of I didn't know. He was saying some version of it was only a guard. It was never only a guard. That was the whole misunderstanding, the one their entire morning had been built on. They had looked at the man in the ceremonial uniform and seen decoration, a thing for tourists, a costume, an obstacle to be brushed aside by men with real authority and real devices in their fists. They had failed to grasp the simplest and oldest fact about a sentry at a royal gate, that he is not standing there as himself. He is standing there as the visible edge of something vast and patient and ordinarily invisible, and when you strike him, you are not striking a man. You are reaching past him with your own hand and ringing a bell that cannot be unrung. The convoy reached the head of the forecourt and stopped, not braked, stopped, all 6 vehicles at once, with a precision that drew a gasp from the crowd. Doors opened, and from the lead vehicle stepped a figure in a long dark coat with a single band of crimson at the collar, a man perhaps 60, with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime being obeyed without ever once having to raise his voice to secure it. I recognized the type before I recognized the rank. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the cameras. He looked, across the length of the forecourt, at one thing only. He looked at his sergeant, still standing his post. And then, slowly, deliberately, in front of the foreign delegation and the tourists and my lens and the whole bright morning, The man in the long coat raised his gloved hand to his brow and held it there, and saluted the guard. I have the footage. I have watched it on a large screen many times, frame by frame, and I still cannot fully explain why that single gesture hit the crowd the way it did. The man saluted nobody else. Not the minister, not the delegation, not the cameras. He crossed a forecourt full of dignitaries and powerful men, and he gave the only mark of respect in his body to a sergeant in a bearskin who had just been shocked off his feet, and in doing so he answered the foreign detail's whole argument without saying a word to them. You wanted to know who that man was, the salute said. He is mine, and what is mine you do not touch. Sergeant Wren returned it. A crisp, exact salute, white glove flashing once in the light, and then both men's hands came down together, and the sergeant resumed his stance, and the man in the long coat lowered his arm and finally, turned his attention to the delegation by the stranded car. He walked. He did not hurry. I have known generals and ministers and 1 or 2 actual kings in my years at the rope, and I have learned that real authority almost never moves quickly, because hurrying admits that something is escaping you, and nothing was escaping this man. He crossed the cobbles with his coat moving around his legs and stopped a precise, deliberate distance from the deputy minister, close enough to be heard, far enough to make the minister come the last step if he wanted to be closer. And the two of them stood there, the foreign cabinet's deputy and the man in crimson at the collar, while the wall above them stayed full of silent figures, and the convoy idled at the head of the forecourt, and not one person in that whole crowd dared to speak. Sir, the man in the long coat said. His voice was not loud. The morning had gone so still that it didn't need to be. I am the Lord Steward of this household. You have been our guest for 11 minutes. In that time, 3 men of your detail have struck, shocked, and attempted to remove a sworn guardsman from his post at this gate. A pause, waited exactly. I would like you to explain to me how that came to happen on my forecourt. The deputy minister's mouth opened. I watched him reach, the way powerful men do, for the lever that has always worked the rank, the reminder of who he was, the implication of consequences that flow downhill onto small people who inconvenience large ones. There has been, he began, a misunderstanding regarding protocol. My detail believed the man would not yield the path and security required. Security. The Lord Steward let the word sit there until it curdled. Your detail required security from a ceremonial sentry who was standing still. He turned his head, just slightly, toward the suited man who'd given the orders, who had gone, I noticed, a color I can only call ash. You, step forward. The suited man did not want to step forward. Every part of his body declared it. But there is a particular gravity that certain men carry, a thing the suit and the device and the borrowed authority had never given him and never could, and that gravity drew him forward one reluctant step onto the cobblestones, into the open space between the two principals, where the whole forecourt could see him. You gave the order to tase him, the Lord Steward said. It was not a question. The man's accent was thicker now, his composure gone. He refused a lawful. There is nothing lawful about your hand on that man. The Lord Steward's voice never rose, and that was the terrible thing about it. It just went colder level after level like a stair descending into a cellar. You are on the soil of this crown. That gate is the threshold of this house. The man you struck holds it by an oath older than your nation's constitution, and behind that oath stands every resource this kingdom possesses, which you have now obliged me to demonstrate. Look up. The suited man did not move. Look up, the Lord Steward repeated, and this time the man's chin lifted, and he saw the wall, the dozens of dark figures along the parapet, the closed inner gates, the convoy, the men who had come up out of the quiet floor of the palace to stand in the daylight for the first time in living memory. And I watched the understanding arrive on his face the way water arrives in a sinking boat. You believed, the Lord Steward went on, that you had found a man you could push, a decoration, A toy soldier, as I'm told your kind likes to say. He let that land. Let me tell you what you actually did. You assaulted the king's red at the king's gate in front of the king's cameras, which record everything that happens on these stones whether you can see them or not. And the moment your colleague's device touched his hand, a protocol you have never heard of and will never be cleared to read executed itself, automatically, the way a circuit closes. The gates locked, the wall manned, the convoy turned. One call went out from a room you will never enter, and it reached within 90 seconds the foreign office of your own government, your ambassador, and the desk of your minister's superior, who is, I am given to understand, considerably less amused than you were 11 minutes ago. I lowered my phone, I will be honest with you. I lowered it for a moment, not because I wanted to stop recording, but because I wanted just once to see it with my own eyes and not through a screen. The deputy minister's face, the dawning ruin of the morning he had thought beneath his notice. He had come for a courtesy call. He was going to leave inside a diplomatic incident with his own capital's fingerprints already on it, set in motion not by any decision of the king's, but by the simple closing of a circuit when a foreign hand struck a sworn man. The kingdom had not deliberated. It had not debated whether the insult merited a response. It had simply rallied, the way a body rallies around a wound, automatically and at scale. And the men who'd thrown the punch were only now learning that the smallest figure on the field had been the most dangerous thing to touch. This is excessive, the minister tried, and even he seemed to hear how thin it sounded. For one guard. For one guard. The Lord Steward turned fully to face him, and for the first time something that was almost warmth crossed his hard face, though it was not warmth for the minister. You still don't understand, and I find I no longer have the patience to teach you. So I will say it once plainly, and then my people will see your delegation off these grounds. He glanced back across the forecourt to where Sergeant Wren stood his post in the morning light, unbroken, unmoving, the line of sweat long since dried on his jaw. That man held his post while 3 of yours hit him. He did not raise his hand. He did not raise his voice. He chose with everything in him to do nothing but stand because he trusted that we would answer for him. And we have. He turned back. His voice dropped to something the cameras barely caught. Something I only have because the microphone in my phone is better than my ears. You disrespected the post, the Lord Steward said. Now you answer to the kingdom. What followed, I watched in pieces, because the outer sentries kept moving the crowd back, and because the morning had begun to move faster than any one set of eyes could hold. But I am a reporter, and over the days that followed, I gathered the pieces and set them in order, and I can tell you how the kingdom answered fully from the gate outward. It began with the gate itself, and it did not stop there. While the Lord Steward was speaking, the block had been changing around us without my noticing. The boulevard that ran past the forecourt, the one the convoy had come down, had gone quiet in a way no city street is ever quiet at mid-morning. No traffic. At both ends of it, perhaps 200 yards in either direction, the road had been closed. I could see, now that I looked, the dark shapes of vehicles parked across it and figures standing beside them, and the ordinary river of the city diverted away from this one stretch of stone as if it had never existed. The palace had not merely locked its own gate. It had reached out and taken the whole street, and the side streets feeding it, and held them shut while it dealt with its guests. A woman near me, a local, said it best in a small, stunned voice. They closed the city. For one of them, they closed the city. The delegation's own vehicles, the long black car at the inner gate, and 2 more parked behind it, were now boxed front and back by the household's machines. There was no scenario in which the deputy minister was driving himself out of Renmore on his own schedule. He would leave when he was permitted to leave, by the route he was permitted to take, and not 1 second before, and the understanding of that was visible in the set of his shoulders as a pair of the dull-clothed men from the quiet floor moved up on either side of him. Not touching him, never touching him, simply being there, a courtesy that was also a cage. The three who had laid hands on the sergeant were dealt with separately, and first, I watched it happen near the stranded car. The suited man who'd given the orders, and the one who'd worked the device, and the third who'd done the shoving. They were drawn apart from the rest of the delegation by the household's men, and their own devices and sidearms were taken from them with a quiet efficiency that allowed for no debate, and they were walked, one at a time, toward a side gate in the wall that I had never seen open in all my years at that rope. They did not go into the palace. They went into the apparatus behind it, the part with no windows the public can find, and what happened to them inside it that day is not mine to tell, because I do not know it and I will not pretend I do. I know only that they walked in as men who had pushed a statue for fun, and that whatever they walked out as, they walked out smaller. The diplomacy of it moved even faster than the men. I learned this later, from sources I had spent 19 years cultivating and never had a reason to truly use until that week. The Lord Steward had told the truth about the call. There had been a call, a single one, from the room he'd mentioned, and it had not gone to the press or to the police, but straight up the spine of two governments at once. By the time the deputy minister was being walked toward his boxed-in car, his own ambassador was already on a line to the household, already apologizing, already using the careful, sweating language of a man trying to keep a courtesy call from becoming a recalled mission. The minister's superior in the foreign capital, the actual cabinet figure whose deputy this was, had been woken, or pulled from a meeting, or however these things happen at that altitude, and had grasped in about 4 seconds what his deputy had failed to grasp in 11 minutes. That a member of his delegation had assaulted a sworn royal guardsman on foreign palace ground in front of cameras, and that the only road left ran through total, immediate, humiliating contrition. The deputy minister did not finish his courtesy call. There was, by then, no courtesy left to call upon. He was escorted to his car, the boxing vehicles peeled back just far enough to let it move, and the whole delegation was driven out of Renmore under household escort, down the closed boulevard between the dark parked machines and the watching figures, and away. The grand banquet that had been planned for that evening, the formal one, the white tie affair the courtesy call was meant to precede, quietly did not happen. The official line, days later, was a change in the delegation's travel schedule. I knew better. Everyone at the rope that morning knew better. The kingdom had uninvited a cabinet from its table over a hand laid on a sentry, and it had done so without a single raised voice, because it did not need to raise its voice. It only needed to close the circuit. Through all of it, the locked gates, the manned wall, the closed city, the boxed cars, the three men walked through the side gate, the convoy, the Lord Steward's cold and level voice. Through every minute of the answer the kingdom gave, Sergeant Aldous Wren stood his post. That is the image I cannot let go of, even more than the salute. The world rearranged itself around him. An entire apparatus of state, invisible for decades, rose up out of the stone and the walls and the quiet floor and the foreign offices of 2 capitals, all of it set in motion by 3 blows landed on one man, and that one man, the cause of all of it, the center of the whole storm, simply held his stance at the gate as though nothing had happened at all. He did not watch the delegation be escorted out. He did not watch the 3 men walk to the side gate. His eyes stayed forward on that point above the heads of the crowd, where a sentry's eyes are supposed to stay, and he let the kingdom do the answering, because the answering was not his job. His job was to stand, and he had not for one instant stopped doing it. I found out his name that afternoon, working my sources, and I found out one other thing that I sat on for a long time before I understood what to do with it. The protocol the Lord Steward had referred to, the automatic one, the circuit that closes when a foreign hand strikes a sworn man at the gate, was real, and it was old, and it had a name within the household that I was asked not to print, and have honored that request. But the reason it existed, the reason a kingdom would build such a thing and keep it dormant for years waiting for a morning exactly like this one, was the part that changed how I saw the whole affair. It existed because of the stillness. Because the only way you can ask a man to stand at a gate and take a blow without raising his hand, the only way that is not simply cruelty, is to promise him in advance and in iron that he will never stand alone, that every restraint he shows will be answered, that his discipline is not weakness offered up to be exploited, but a contract he holds, and the kingdom holds him. The sergeant had not failed to defend himself that morning. He had defended himself in the deepest way there is. He had trusted the contract. And the kingdom, watching from behind its hidden eyes, had moved heaven and earth to prove the contract good. I filed my story that night, and then I did something I had not done in 19 years at the rope. I went back to the footage, the full clip, the one my phone had caught from the first crack of the gloved hand to the salute and beyond, and I sat with it for a long time before I posted it, because I understood that once I let it go, it would belong to the world, and I wanted to be sure of what I was sending into the world. In my business, you learn to fear the viral thing, because the viral thing is almost always the worst of us, amplified. Cruelty travels. Outrage travels. I had spent 2 decades watching the ugliest minutes of human behavior race around the planet, while the decent ones died quietly on the vine. This was not that. This was the opposite of that, and I think some part of me had stopped believing the opposite could still travel. I posted it, and it went the way these things go now, faster than any story I have ever filed. By morning it had been watched more times than every article I'd written in my career combined. But here is the part that mattered to me, the part I held on to. Of all the millions of people who watched a man get shocked and shoved at a foreign palace gate, almost none of them came away talking about the violence. They came away talking about the stillness, about the salute, about the moment the convoy turned and the wall filled and a kingdom rose up, silent and total, around one man who had refused to so much as lift his hand. The comments, which are usually a sewer, read that week like something else. Men my age, men older, men who had worn uniforms of their own in other places and other years, writing in their plain way about what it was they recognized in that sergeant's stance. They knew it. They had stood it, some of them, on cold lines a long way from home, and they understood in their bones what the tourists in the sun hats had to be told. That the hardest thing a disciplined man ever does is not to act, but to hold, to take the blow, and trust the line behind him to be real. I went back to Renmore a week later. I told myself it was to follow up the story, to get a comment, to do the things reporters do. The truth is I wanted to see him again. I wanted to know whether the morning had marked him, whether a man could go through what he'd gone through and stand the same gate the same way. He was there. Of course he was there. Same post, same red wool, same tall black bearskin catching the same morning light, eyes forward on the same point above the heads of the same gathering crowd. If you had walked up to that gate knowing nothing, you would have seen only a ceremonial guardsman doing a ceremonial job, a thing for tourists, a costume, a statue. You would have had no idea that 1 week earlier the whole machinery of a kingdom had risen up out of the stone behind him. You would have had no idea what was standing there. That I finally understood was the entire point. I did not get my comment. You do not interview a man at his post. I knew that, and I would not have insulted him by trying. I stood at the rope for a while among the tourists, and I watched him hold the gate, and after a time I did the only thing that felt right. I caught his eye just for an instant, the way you can, when a sentry's gaze passes across the crowd and you happen to be in its path, and I gave him a small nod. Not a salute. I had no right to that. Just a nod, one man to another, the kind you give to say I saw it, and I understood it, and I will carry it. He did not nod back. He could not. He was on duty, and the whole meaning of him was that he would not break for the small things. But something moved at the corner of his eyes, the faintest possible thing, gone before I could be sure I'd seen it, and I have chosen to believe it was acknowledgement. I have chosen to believe he knew that the morning had been seen and understood, and that the understanding had gone out into the world and done some good. I have been at this a long time. I have stood at 100 gates and watched the powerful come and go, and I have grown more cynical with every year, the way men in my trade tend to. I had come to believe that strength was mostly noise, that the loudest man won, that the hand that struck first won, that the world belonged to the ones willing to shove their way to the front of it. The foreign detail believed that too. It is why they did what they did. They saw a quiet man and mistook his quiet for permission. They were wrong, and the kingdom taught them how wrong, and I got it all on camera. But the lesson I took from that gate was not really about the convoy or the closed city or the call that woke a cabinet, impressive as all of it was. The lesson was the man at the center who never moved, who took the blow and held the line and trusted, against every instinct in the body, that he would not be left to stand alone, and was proven right. That is the strength I had stopped believing in. The strength that does not strike back because it does not have to. The strength that holds. I still have the footage. I expect I will have it until I die. And on the days when the world is loud and ugly and the wrong men seem to be winning, I take it out and I watch the part everyone else skips past. Not the salute, not the convoy, but the long still seconds in the middle. The man in the red and black being shocked and shoved and ordered gone, choosing with his whole disciplined body to do nothing but stand. He never raised his hand. He never had to. The kingdom raised it for him.